the question is, why doesn't the UK apologise for the Amritsar Massacre? So I'm going to give you a very, very brief history of the Amritsar Massacre before we do anything else. So the Amritsar Massacre happened on the 3rd of April 1919, and essentially hundreds of men, women and children from that particular area were gathered around the Jallianwala Bagh, which was a kind of a big park, essentially. It was a religious festival as well, so people were playing games and having picnics and stuff like that as well, and there was also a peaceful protest happening. I want to emphasize that it was a peaceful protest that was happening. People were gathered to listen to a few speakers and things like that. And the reason why they were gathered in the park was because this is just after World War I, and the British had implemented a series of laws called the Rowlatt Act. Now, these acts basically limited what Indians could do after the war. So it included things like curfews, for example. The media was still censored, etc. And considering the contribution that India had just made to World War I, it seemed completely unfair that in the immediate aftermath of World War I, Indians were being treated in this way. So that's why people were gathered. And there had been a series of sort of protests in the days leading up to this. And what happened was a British general called General Rex Dyer. He ordered troops to open fire on these crowds that were gathered in the park. So remember, these are men, women and children, the elderly, etc. They fired 1,650 rounds of ammunition in 10 minutes. And people were trying, there was no way for people to escape from the park because it was enclosed. So we don't know the exact figures, like with so many things to do with South Asian history. The records are not the best, but we know that, at least sort of 400-ish people were killed. You've got about 1,500 people wounded. General Dyer ordered the troops to leave immediately and not to give any help to anyone who was injured or anything like that either. And yeah, that's what happened. In the immediate aftermath, Indians were treated incredibly harshly after the event happened. So third-class railway tickets were taken away, for example, so people couldn't actually leave to go somewhere else. Electricity and water was cut off. There were floggings. There were all these sort of additional horrific things that happened after that. There were investigations into what happened. General Rex Dyer was censured, so that means that he was basically sort of had to step down from his role, but no criminal charges were given to him. And actually, there's just so many awful things. So I'll give you this anecdote, which is there was a paper called the Morning Post paper, and they actually raised money for him to buy him a sword of honor, which is just gross, isn't it? So yeah, there was an Indian investigation into it as well. They concluded that this was an incalculable piece of inhumanity. But again, nothing was sort of, there were no consequences for Britain, etc. So the question was, why don't Britain apologise for this? I think one of the reasons is if Britain apologised for it, we'd have to shed light on it, wouldn't we? More people would have to know about it. We'd have to talk about it. And we don't like talking about the empire. And we don't like talking about, the bad things. And I, Salma, you mentioned this already. And I thought it was really, when I was looking into this question, so David Cameron went to the Jallianwala Bagh in 2013, and he didn't apologise. He said that it was a shameful kind of piece of history. And I wanted to quote what he said, because I guess this is the answer to the question: why doesn't Britain apologise? And Britain's answer is this: Britain say, I don't think the right thing is to reach back into history and seek out things you can apologise for. I think we need to, and he said something along the lines of, I think we need to acknowledge what happened, recall what happened, and learn, kind of show respect and understanding of what happened. So this got me thinking, this was in 2013. So do we think since 2013 there has been any sort of journey in this country when it comes to an understanding of the empire? I think we're seeing it now, shown by the fact that we're having this panel discussion, right? So I just think it's really interesting that I think what he said is important. I do think acknowledging what happened, I think that is really important, but I don't think anyone has acknowledged that happened. And I think it's only in the context of Black Lives Matter and in the context of, Edward Colston's statue being dumped in the river in Bristol, that started a conversation about empire in this country in a way that I've never seen before. And I think it's taken 7 years of inaction and no one really in the mainstream talking about this to maybe have a conversation. I think essentially it's for all of us and for all of the people around us to carry on that conversation. So I guess, why don't they apologise for it? Well, David Cameron said it. He doesn't think that they should, is what I can gather from his sort of statement. And I think what we may be seeing now is at least steps being taken towards really critically looking at the empire, and really sort of, and moving away from this awful, and Salma, you'll know this from school, this awful idea when you learn about when people learn about the empire in school, and it's this idea of, right, the last lesson, we'll do a good and bad, we'll do a balance.
Oh my gosh, I've seen that. I saw like a post on Twitter where it was like successes and failures of the empire, or like positives and negatives. I was like, how are you gonna minimize this whole piece of history into like a table?
Well, that's what it does. It literally will have, oh, well, they massacred people in India, but they gave them railways.
That came up in a seminar once, and I was so shocked. Like, some guy in my second year seminar said, oh, but India got railways, and I was like, you got to second year of uni and you're telling me that? Like, how?
That's so funny, because I did history at LSE, but I had an interview at another university to do history, and the lecturer said the same thing to me when I was talking about all the reading that I'd done about India, and he came up with, oh, but what about the railways? And I thought, I'm not coming to your university.
Goodbye.
And I didn't, because I thought, what? But that's crazy that I went to university, you know, many years before you. That's still happening, isn't it? So I guess in order to round up this question, I guess, you know, all the stuff that we've seen in the news at the moment, you know, the government, the education, you know, the education sector, whatever, they're not even placing Black history front and centre of the curriculum at the moment. So I think us expecting an apology for the Amritsar Massacre, I really don't think it's going to happen. But what I do think might be happening now is that more people may be aware of the Amritsar Massacre happening, and the acknowledgement of that, and the reflections that we need to do on that. So I think hopefully that is what's going to start to happen. And certainly people like us are not going to stop talking about it. So yeah, that's my final answer.
I just want to add like one small thing, because I did my dissertation on the Jallianwala Bagh massacre, and I remember researching, and I think Theresa May recently, I think it was in 2019, she described the massacre as like a shameful scar, and I feel like that lends itself to the question in terms of that idea of a scar seems like a one-off thing. So she's representing the empire and like that massacre as like one bad thing that the British Empire might have done, but oh, it's only one small thing, so it's not that big of a deal. And similarly, I did some reading on the politics of apology in relation to why Britain hasn't apologized, and I can't remember the author of this article, but it was essentially talking about like the power hierarchies that happen when someone apologizes for something, and how when you're in the act of apologizing, you're lowering your hierarchy and like you're the lowered status. So I feel like if the government were to apologize, they know that if in the act of apologizing, they're then lowering the idea of this British Empire, like this glorious, amazing thing. And that is bad for them, because then if they're not really apologizing for that one massacre, they're then having to apologize and say, okay, the British Empire was terrible and did horrible things. But because they don't want to apologize for the whole of the British Empire, they're therefore not going to apologize for anything, because in that one apologizing, they're going to have to like look at everything, and like you said, they just don't want to acknowledge it.
Yeah, definitely. And it's interesting because there've been a couple of, you know, really high profile people that have asked for an apology. Sadiq Khan asked for an apology when he went to visit. Shashi Tharoor, if you've not seen the video of him talking about the need for an apology, then I'd really recommend doing that. And you know, I guess this broadens out to so many things. You know, I've had so many conversations at the dinner table about why can't we get the Koh-i-Noor back? You know, and it's sort of, you know, and this sort of idea about apologising for the Amritsar massacre, it's one part of so many injustices, right, to do with the empire. And it's like, do you think, you know, is there a fear that there'll almost be a domino effect? Kind of what you tell, I guess, that, you know, if they apologise for this, will that then mean, you know, that demands for the Koh-i-Noor, for example, would have more traction, you know, and is this idea of the empire just going to, you know, collapse at the seams? So I think they don't want to give anything.
Yeah, I feel like if they apologize, and they're scared of what else people will ask for. But I think I listened to a podcast as well in my research, and this person was interviewing someone that was alive at the time, and they essentially said, we literally don't want anything other than an apology. Like, that's all we want. All we want is for you to say, okay, we did something wrong and it was bad, but you're not even giving us that. Like, you think that we're going to be like, oh, okay, once you've said an apology, we want this from you and this from you and this from you. It's literally just you saying, we're sorry and this shouldn't have happened, but that's not going to happen.